Hi, and welcome everyone to the San Francisco Dance Film Festival. My name is Manjula Varghese. I'm a documentary filmmaker and journalist based here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I've been a part of the advisory committee with the San Francisco Dance Film Festival, and at this festival, we have had the pleasure of screening the film Uprooted, a beautiful documentary that goes into the history of jazz dance. And today, we get to speak to Lisa Reeve and her team who created this beautiful documentary. Lisa, I would love for you to introduce the team that you got to work with.
Thank you so much, Manjula. My name is Lisa Donmall-Reeve. I'm the producer. I'm here in LA. So this is Khadifa Wong, the director in London. Joan Gill Amorim, who's also in London. We got Matt Simpkins in New York, who's the director of photography. And last but not least, we've got Zak Nemorin, who's in London. And Zak came up with the original idea for the film, and he also did the additional choreography in the film. So that's our kind of core creative team.
Wonderful. Well, Zak, you came up with the concept. I would love to know how you decided this was something that needed to be made. Talk to me a bit about how that came about.
I suppose I kind of recognized that a lot of our elders were beginning to pass away. Actually, one of my teachers passed away, and I have been in West End musical theatre for nearly 20 years now, and I started getting in conversations about where jazz dance began. I decided to do a degree in my mid-30s and study again. And I based it on jazz dance, and I realized that actually not that many people knew much about the history of jazz dance and where it came from. And I wanted to just delve into the history and acknowledge and pay homage to our elders, really.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear, Khadifa, can you talk a little bit about how you got started, where you decided to begin this story? Because it goes so far back, and it's obvious when you watch this film. It's so beautiful. It's comprehensive. You really dive deep into the history of jazz dance. So tell me how you started.
Well, we started when Zak approached me to kind of look at the film, and we approached Lisa. Lisa was the one that suggested doing the entire history of jazz dance, and was like, I don't know the entire history. And so once you kind of start looking at that, and you see the conversations that were already being had in the dance world, for example, with the publication of the book Jazz Dance: A History of the Roots and Branches, they were having these conversations about sort of race and its kind of impact on jazz dance. So we knew that we had to highlight that. So then if you look at Black history in America, you have to start before slavery to look at Black history. And so when we got into the editing suite with Joan, she was the one that kind of put it in a linear timetable, and we kind of started building that timeline. And that was the kind of it in a nutshell. It was a lot broader and a lot more complex than that, but that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I'm curious to know how you even began the production. Like, where did you start?
We had a test, I would say it was like our pilot run in London, where we filmed for 3 days and interviewed a lot of people. So we were in familiar territory because it was people that we knew, and Lisa, Zak, and I are all from London. And based on those conversations, you know, the stories start to form. You start to realize where you can kind of pull from. And as I did my research between London and New York and started to really formulate that this is more of a social documentary as opposed to just a dance documentary, that's when it began to take shape. And so by the time we hit New York, we kind of had a nice kind of molding of, we knew we wanted to address certain topics, but we didn't really kind of formulate the entire story until we got into the edit. We just let people speak and get as many opinions as we possibly could that we would then collate, because we had taken that decision early on that it wasn't up to us to dictate anything, it was us to present every voice, because the one thing that was clear is that not everybody's voices are being heard. And so we thought that that would be the best kind of vehicle for us to be, is to be people that will allow others to speak. And that's how we kind of started to formulate the film.
And then, Joan, I know they always say that, you know, a film really comes together in the edit. So how did you piece it together? How did you know how did you sift through all the footage? How many hours of footage did you have, and how did you sift through that?
Hours of footage, I don't even know, in the, high hundreds, maybe thousands, between archive, beautiful dance footage, interviews, things like that. yeah, it is like putting a puzzle together, and it's great because documentary especially, you don't know what the story is going to be until you start to hear what everyone's saying again, and certain things that we would have thought didn't pan out, or it's like, oh, someone said this, let's follow this. So yeah, Khadifa and I just started listening to all the interviews every single day. Like she said, we made a timeline of not just dance history, but world events, US events, what's going on everywhere, what is happening on Broadway, what musicals are coming out, just to see, and then to figure out how we wanted to tell this story. And so it just, yeah, you just have to listen to everything everyone's saying and kind of follow what the common threads are.
Within the final film, we've got like 51 interviews over 4 countries and 11 cities, and that isn't even the full spread of interviews that we actually managed to get. We got close to 80 interviews in the end, so that's to kind of give a bit of perspective on how many people we filmed.
Wow.
And how much footage we had.
Yeah, it sounds like it was extremely comprehensive, the amount of research that went into this. And how did you start the research in regards to the African American history, like the influence that history had on jazz dance? Because it's clear, especially in the beginning, and then throughout, it's the through line in the entire documentary is how much influence came from that community. How did you begin that part of the research?
I mean, that wasn't news to me because I'd grown up in a household. My dad was, an activist as well. So we'd always had that influences. He'd met Angela Davis, done some work with Malcolm X. So I'd always had this kind of influence of African American history and the struggles that go along with it. And he kept us informed throughout. So really, it was just making sure that I fact checked what I knew and read as much as I could and read as a diverse kind of range of books as possible. So it wasn't just reading jazz dance, it was reading African American history, it was reading American history, it was watching documentaries that tackled those things and just trying to get as much kind of knowledge as I could. And that was kind of, it was just kind of refreshing what which is that, the history of America is not a nice one, unfortunately.
Yeah, it isn't. And I actually kept thinking about the fact that we tend to shy away from our own history. We don't want to dive into it. So it's wonderful that, a team like yours came together to do that, because it's absolutely necessary. I was wondering how much of the current climate influenced the storytelling in this project.
It's an interesting one because people say to us, oh, it's so timely. And we had finished this film a year before. So none of what's currently happening was happening. And so it was actually, we weren't sure how it was going to be received, because what we're saying normally has been falling on deaf ears for the last 400 years. It's only now that people are starting to listen. And when I say people, I mean white people are starting to listen. So we were saying those things 2 years ago because we were in the edit a year before that, and we were filming before that. So we, as a group, were already having these very difficult conversations and having to go through all of these kind of issues that having those conversations kind of arise from. So it just so happened that the world kind of changed between us finishing the film and it coming out. So
and it's very powerful, and it really speaks to the sentiment of knowing your history and understanding where things come from. And Matt, I'd love to hear how you chose to approach the visuals on telling this story.
I come from a dance background, so it was really nice to be able to marry my 2 worlds from my professional dance career, and now that I'm a cinematographer, being able to marry those 2 worlds definitely was a treat. I remember our first conversations with Khadifa and Zak revolved around wanting to make sure we kept it cinematic and not too just kind of raw documentary. We wanted to make sure we had a visual aesthetic. So it focused around things like keeping the old gritty New York City 1980s dance studios alive, not going into clean, bright, beautiful studios all the time for filming. We wanted to make sure every interviewee had their own aesthetic, their own visual style. And we wanted to shoot the dancers like you were a dancer in the middle of it. Being a dancer, that's how I relate to the movement. I don't necessarily relate to it like the old school Fred Astaire locked off proscenium shots. I wanted to get in the middle. I wanted to feel the sweat, hear them breathe, and try to bring that to the audience as well.
So the moment in the film, or actually it's used throughout the film as a way to kind of connect the different segments. There's this beautiful dancing that's choreographed. I guess it's choreographed outside. There's an African dancer. It's beautifully done and kind of ties the African history and the influence into jazz dance. And I was just wondering if you can speak to that, how that came about, how you decided to pull that into the piece.
Khadifa and I had always talked from the beginning that we wanted to open the film with something that harkened back to that vibe, to that visual aesthetic, and to that storyline. So we had various renditions of it, and Lisa had found this beautiful dancer in LA. We were in LA and we said, you know what, let's go. Let's see if we can try and figure out what this can be. It wasn't necessarily storyboarded. It wasn't necessarily completely fully filled out. So we went to a location that we thought was going to be promising. I remember just running around looking for the perfect spot with the perfect tree. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. We found that and I screamed, get over here, let's go, because the light was perfect, the tree was magnificent, and yeah, and you know, we wanted to shoot it handheld for that kind of organic life, full of breath feeling. So yeah, I mean, it's one of my favorite visual moments of the film.
Can you speak to the choreography of that, Zach?
Wonderfully, Usha, who was our dancer, she just takes on direction. So me and Khadifa were working together because I had already choreographed a kind of like a seed kind of like motif, and then Khadifa was going, right, it needs to say this, it needs to say that. So me, Khadifa, Usha just worked together as a team and just went, right, it needs to kind of go that way, feel like this. Khadifa, I'm sure you'll probably speak more about this, but we just kind of went with it and just rolled with it. It was a very, very organic process.
I loved the interstitial dance sequences that were in the piece. I was just wondering, I know it's a long film, but it's not long enough to really cover the entire, I'm sure, encompass the entire history of jazz dance. Were there elements or things that ended up on the cutting room floor that you wished had ended up in the film? Is there anything you could share with us?
We would love to expand on so many of the sections. There's no way we're as soon as we dived into the film, we were like, whoa, this is really ambitious. But I think I'm very proud of what we've done to cover the history as well as we've done.
And is there, what do you hope your audience walks away after seeing the film, after sitting with it? What do you hope they walk away thinking? And
I hope people talk more, I think would be the one thing.
Yeah, just to have learned something. Like my mum watched it and she, she's not a dancer, but she was like, wow, I learned so much. And just that's what documentaries are for, to make you curious and to expand your mind and come away going, wow, I didn't know that.
I would add to that, just that in addition to researching, to questioning kind of the histories, because like you said, in the US, we don't like to acknowledge certain histories. And certainly I grew up in Virginia and we're taught very specific histories. And so we had a lot of people that were in the dance community saying, I didn't realize this is where it came from. And so maybe to look at that in your areas of interest as well, like, well, what are those real roots? Because, America specifically, but the world everything is influenced and comes together. So, just figure out where it came from and why, and it makes it all more interesting. So maybe question the things you have been taught a bit more as well.
I will say that when I watched the film, that is kind of what I walked away with. I was very much aware of the fact that I didn't know the history, and I was really grateful that I got to watch a documentary that kind of helped me understand the nuances of what influenced this dance form. Is there any final thoughts that you would like to share?
I hope the message of the film is inclusivity, community, and that it makes people curious. and brings joy, because it did for us making it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And we are so glad that we got to speak to you. And we hope that for those of you watching, that you will go check out Uprooted. It's an amazing documentary about the history of jazz, and it's screening with the SF Dance Film Festival. And we hope that if you've already seen it, that you check out the rest of our programming. And thank you again for joining us.